The biting Colorado air nipped at Zariah's cheeks, a stark contrast to the humid Indiana autumns she was used to. Franklin High loomed before her, a brick and glass monolith, indifferent to the tremor in her gut. Each step towards the entrance felt weighted, the crunch of gravel under her boots echoing the uncertain rhythm of her heart. She was a study in contrast, worn leather jacket over a faded band tee, combat boots laced tight, a canvas backpack slung low on her hip. Her gaze, though, was the most arresting feature, calm, almost unnervingly so, the kind of look that seemed to see through the superficial. Inside, the air was thick with the hormonal buzz of adolescence, a cacophony of laughter, shouted greetings, and the rhythmic thud of lockers slamming shut. Zariah navigated the crowded hallways, her senses on high alert, absorbing the alien landscape. It was a place where unspoken rules and subtle cues dictated the social hierarchy. She could feel the curious stares, the whispers that trailed in her wake. Different. That was the unspoken verdict. Across the hall, three figures detached themselves from the throng. Addison, with her perfectly tousled blonde hair and a smile that could cut glass, was flanked by Tinsley and Bailey. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, raked over Zariah. Addison's gaze lingered on the worn patches on Zariah's jacket, then flicked up to meet her unwavering stare. A flicker of something akin to annoyance, perhaps even a challenge, flashed in her eyes. This newcomer, this quiet girl with the unsettlingly direct gaze, didn't seem to register the power she wielded in these halls. It was an affront to the natural order of things, an imbalance that Addison instinctively sought to correct. Tinsley, ever the eager lieutenant, mirrored Addison's expression, a sneer curling her lip. Bailey, though, looked away, a fleeting shadow of unease crossing her face. She'd seen that look before, that quiet stillness, and it made her stomach churn. It reminded her of a predator, calmly assessing its prey. The bell shrilled, cutting through the air like a siren. Zariah moved with a fluid grace that belied the weight of her boots, slipping into the history classroom just as the last stragglers hurried through the door. Mr. Granger, a man whose enthusiasm for the past bordered on evangelical, beamed at the new arrival. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. Zariah Coleman, from Indiana. Zariah, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?" His voice, though cheerful, held a hint of practiced patience, the tone of a teacher well-versed in the awkward dance of first-day introductions. Zariah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Just Zariah is fine," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of the usual nervous tremor. "I moved here with my aunt." Her words were economical, devoid of embellishment. The class, accustomed to more effusive introductions, shifted restlessly. Addison exchanged a knowing glance with Tinsley. This girl, this Zariah, was clearly not playing by their rules. She was an anomaly, a blank canvas that begged to be marked. Zariah chose a seat in the back row, by the window. The fractured sunlight painted patterns on the dusty surface of the desk, mirroring the fragmented thoughts swirling in her mind. She'd hoped to blend in, to become invisible against the backdrop of this new environment. But even in her silence, she stood out. Her father's lessons echoed in her ears, a constant refrain of preparedness and self-reliance. "Be the gray rock, Zariah," he'd said, his voice rough with experience. "Don't draw attention to yourself. But if they come for you," his words trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts in body language, the micro-expressions that betrayed intent. She'd learned to move with a quiet confidence, a stillness that masked the coiled strength within. She'd learned to be a survivor. But even her father's training couldn't fully quell the unease that gnawed at her. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were whispers and ostracism, where the wounds were invisible but no less deep. The first few days passed in a blur of whispered taunts and pointed stares. Zariah maintained her silence, her gaze fixed on some distant point, a fortress built of indifference. The bullies, accustomed to immediate reactions, found her stoicism unsettling. Addison, in particular, was used to wielding her social power with surgical precision, her words like poison darts. But Zariah's impassivity rendered her weapons useless, like striking at smoke. The frustration simmered beneath Addison's carefully crafted facade, a crack in the veneer of her effortless confidence. She saw Zariah's silence not as fear, but as a challenge, a silent defiance that grated on her nerves. "She thinks she's too good for us," she hissed to Tinsley and Bailey, the words laced with venom. "We'll see how long that lasts." The escalation began subtly. A tripped foot in the hallway, a snide remark about her clothes, her locker mysteriously decorated with gum and insults scrawled in lipstick. Each act, though seemingly insignificant, was designed to chip away at Zariah's composure, to provoke a reaction, to draw her into their game. But Zariah remained unmoved. Her outward indifference, however, was a carefully constructed mask. Beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The constant barrage of petty cruelties, the relentless whispers that followed her like shadows, began to take their toll. The gray rock was beginning to crack. She felt a flicker of anger, hot and sharp, a dangerous ember in the icy landscape of her control. She reminded herself of her father's words. "Control your emotions, Zariah. They are your weakness." But the whispers were like a constant drip, eroding her carefully constructed defenses. The breaking point came in the locker room after gym class. Zariah was changing, her back to the room, when she felt a sudden shove. Her head snapped back, her gaze locking onto Addison, who stood there, a smirk playing on her lips. Tinsley and Bailey flanked her, their expressions a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Oops," Addison said, feigning innocence. "Didn't see you there." The words were dripping with sarcasm. Zariah's breath hitched, the carefully constructed wall of indifference crumbling. Something snapped. The gray rock shattered. The quiet storm within her erupted. The fluorescent lights of the Franklin High School cafeteria hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the low roar of adolescent chatter. Zariah Coleman sat alone at a table near the back, a fortress of solitude constructed from her backpack and an open textbook. She wasn't reading, not really. Her gaze drifted across the room, cataloging the intricate social ecosystem unfolding around her. Cliques huddled like flocks of birds, their laughter and whispers echoing in the cavernous space. The air was thick with the scent of reheated pizza and teenage anxieties, a familiar cocktail that Zariah had only just begun to taste in this new town. Colorado was a far cry from the quiet fields of Indiana, a different breed of wilderness altogether. A shadow fell across her table. Zariah didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of Addison's overly sweet perfume preceded her, a cloying cloud of synthetic vanilla and something vaguely floral. Addison, flanked by her ever-present shadows, Tinsley and Bailey, moved with the practiced grace of a predator circling its prey. Zariah's grip tightened on her fork, the metal cool against her skin, a small anchor in the rising tide of tension. Ignore them, she told herself, the words a silent mantra. Just ignore them, and they'll go away. This had been her strategy for the past week, a shield of indifference against their relentless taunts. Addison's group slowed their pace as they neared Zariah's table, their laughter dying down to a conspiratorial murmur. Zariah kept her eyes fixed on the untouched salad in front of her, the vibrant green, a stark contrast to the gray of the cafeteria walls. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, searching for a crack in her composure. Don't react, she thought, her stomach clenching. Don't give them the satisfaction. She imagined her father's voice, calm and steady, reminding her to breathe, to control her reactions, to be the still point in storm. Tinsley, never one for subtlety, let out a loud, exaggerated sniff. "What's that smell?" she asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Is it desperation?" A ripple of laughter followed, a carefully orchestrated chorus of cruelty. Zariah's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath her eye. She willed herself to remain impassive, her expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. They want a reaction, she thought, the words a bitter taste in her mouth. They feed on it. Bailey, usually the quietest of the trio, giggled nervously, her eyes darting between Addison and Zariah. Zariah could sense her discomfort, a flicker of unease in the forced laughter. She doesn't want to be here, Zariah realized, a sudden flash of insight. She's just afraid of Addison. The realization, though small, offered a strange sense of solace. It was a reminder that even in the midst of this carefully constructed hierarchy, there were cracks in the facade. Addison, sensing Zariah's continued silence, leaned closer, her voice a low, venomous whisper. You know, she purred, her breath hot against Zariah's ear. Ignoring us won't make us go away. It just makes it more fun. She straightened up, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. We have all the time in the world, Zariah. All the time in the world to make your life a living hell. Zariah's fingers tightened around her fork, the metal digging into her palm. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, pulsed through her veins. She wanted to lash out, to unleash the fury that simmered beneath her carefully constructed calm. But she held back, the image of her father's face flashing in her mind. Control, his voice echoed in her memory. Patience. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air burning in her lungs. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Addison and her entourage sauntered away, their laughter echoing in the now emptying cafeteria. Zariah watched them go, her gaze steady, unblinking. The anger hadn't dissipated, but it had morphed into something colder, harder. A quiet resolve settled in her chest, a steel core forming amidst the turmoil. They might have all the time in the world, but so did she, and she was done playing their games. The silence they had mistaken for weakness was, in fact, the calm before the storm. Zariah closed her textbook, the snap of the cover echoing in the sudden quiet of the cafeteria, a small but distinct sound of defiance. The game had changed. The taste of metal lingered on her tongue, a reminder of the pressure, the restraint. She gathered her things, the weight of her backpack a comforting presence on her shoulders. The cafeteria, once a battleground, now felt empty, the echoes of their taunts fading into the background hum of the fluorescent lights. As she walked out, she caught the eye of another girl, a quiet observer sitting alone at a table near the window. The girl offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that had hung heavy in the air. Zariah returned the nod, a flicker of understanding passing between them. A wordless alliance formed in the shared experience of witnessing the subtle, yet brutal, dance of high school power dynamics. The solitude, Zariah realized, wasn't quite so absolute after all. And in that shared glance, a sliver of hope, thin but resilient, began to bloom in the desolate landscape of her new reality. The aroma of simmering cumin and coriander drifted from the kitchen, a familiar comfort in the unfamiliar landscape of her new life. Zariah sat at the small dining table, the cheap laminate cool against her forearms. Outside, the Colorado sky bled into bruised hues of purple and orange, a stark contrast to the flat, cornfield sunsets of Indiana. She picked at a loose thread on her jeans, the silence in the apartment broken only by the rhythmic clinking of Aunt Marcia's cooking utensils. The quiet, however, wasn't peaceful. It was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the day's events. Zariah had carried them home, tucked away in the hollow spaces of her chest, like stones smoothed by a river, each one a small, hard reminder of her outsider status. Rough day. Marcia's voice, warm and laced with concern, finally broke the silence. She placed a steaming plate of chicken and rice in front of Zariah. You barely touched your lunch. Zariah shrugged, the movement almost imperceptible. Just tired. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Tired wasn't the word. Drained, maybe. Empty. Like they'd sucked the air out of me and left me with nothing but dust. That was closer to the truth, but it was a truth too raw to share, even with Marcia. Marcia sat opposite her, her gaze sharp and knowing. Zariah knew she couldn't hide everything from her aunt. Marcia had a way of seeing through her, like she had X-ray vision for the soul. Maybe that's what happens when you spend your life patching up broken people. Marcia was a nurse, a healer of both physical and emotional wounds. Those girls again? Marcia asked, her voice soft. It wasn't a question, really. More of a statement, laced with weary resignation. Zariah nodded, pushing the rice around her plate with her fork. Why bother explaining? It's always the same story. The whispers in the hallways, the snickers during class, the trip in the cafeteria that sent her tray clattering to the floor. Today it had escalated. Addison, the ringleader, and her shadows, Tinsley and Bailey, had cornered her by the lockers, their words like tiny poison darts. They call me names, Zariah muttered, the words barely audible. She could still feel the sting of their laughter, the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. Marcia sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Zariah, you have to tell someone. Mr. Henderson, the principal's someone. You can't just let them walk all over you. A bitter laugh escaped Zariah's lips. Tell someone? What good would that do? She'd seen how these things played out. The girls would deny it, feign innocence, and she'd be labeled a troublemaker, the outsider who couldn't adjust. Better to stay silent, to become invisible. I handled it, Zariah said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Marcia leaned forward, her eyes searching Zariah's face. How, Zariah? How did you handle it? Zariah pushed a stray grain of rice around her plate. She could tell Marcia what she hadn't done. She hadn't fought back. Not physically, anyway. Her father, a former MMA fighter, had drilled self-defense into her since she could walk. He'd taught her how to break a hold, how to disable an attacker, how to turn fear into fuel. But he'd also taught her restraint, the importance of choosing your battles. And this, she had decided, wasn't a battle worth fighting. Not yet, anyway. I ignored them, she said finally, the word to shield against Marcia's probing gaze. Like they weren't even there. Marcia studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she shook her head, a slow, almost mournful gesture. You can't just go through life fighting shadows, Zariah. Sometimes you have to shine a light on them, expose them for what they are. Zariah's fingers tightened around her fork. I ain't fighting nobody, she mumbled, her voice laced with a quiet defiance that surprised even herself. Fighting shadows? What did she know about shadows? Her shadows were real, flesh and bone, with sharp tongues and cruel smiles. And they were relentless. Marcia reached across the table, her hand covering Zariah's. The warmth of her touch was a stark contrast to the icy knot in Zariah's stomach. Ignoring them is a kind of fight, Zariah. But it's a fight you can't win. It eats away at you, slowly, until there's nothing left. Zariah pulled her hand away, the contact suddenly too much. Marcia's words, meant to be comforting, felt like a weight on her chest. Nothing left? Isn't that the point? To become empty, to become numb, so that their words couldn't touch her. To build walls so high, so thick, that nothing could penetrate. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a harsh scrape against the linoleum floor. I'm going to my room, she said, her voice clipped. The scent of cumin and coriander, once comforting, now felt suffocating. She needed air, space, silence. She needed to be alone with the shadows. As she walked away, she could feel Marcia's gaze on her back, heavy with unspoken worry. She doesn't understand. Zariah didn't want to fight. She just wanted to survive. But a flicker of doubt, a tiny spark of defiance, ignited in the darkness of her heart. Marcia's words, like a prophecy whispered in the wind, echoed in her mind. Sometimes you have to shine a light on them. The thought lingered, unsettling and strangely empowering. Shine a light. The fluorescent lights of Franklin High's hallway hummed a dull, monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Zariah's solitary walk to her locker. The air, thick with the lingering scent of floor wax and teenage angst, felt heavy, pressing against her like an unwelcome embrace. Yesterday's confrontation echoed in the quiet corners of her mind, a discordant melody of shouting voices and the metallic tang of fear. She hadn't spoken to Aunt Marcia about it yet, the words clogging her throat like unshed tears. What was there to say? that the carefully constructed wall of indifference she'd built around herself had crumbled under the weight of their relentless cruelty? Reaching her locker, Zariah's fingers, still slightly sore from yesterday's scuffle, fumbled with the combination lock. A strange, sticky resistance met her touch. Frowning, she pulled her hand back, revealing a thick wad of bubblegum, smeared across the lock. Pink, glittery, and undeniably juvenile. A small, almost involuntary sigh escaped her lips. It was such a petty, predictable act, yet the childishness of it grated on her nerves more than she cared to admit. The shriek of the gym whistle pierced the air, a shrill counterpoint to the rhythmic thud of basketballs and the squeaking of sneakers. Zariah Coleman, tucked away in the corner of the Franklin High Gymnasium, felt a familiar wave of detachment wash over her. Dodgeball. Another opportunity to become a human target. She pulled her dark hair back, the elastic snapping against her skin, a small, sharp sensation that anchored her in the present. Just survive, she told herself, the mantra echoing the quiet strength instilled by years of her father's training. Survive and go home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the polished wooden floor. The air hung thick with the scent of sweat and rubber. Zariah watched as the class divided into two teams, a chaotic swirl of adolescent energy. She'd chosen a position at the edge, hoping to blend into the background, to become invisible. A futile hope, she realized as Addison's sharp laugh cut through the air, a predator's call identifying its prey. Zariah had been at Franklin High for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of subtle jabs, whispered insults, and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. Addison and her entourage Tinsley, the sharp-tongued lieutenant, and Bailey, the quiet follower, had made it their mission to make Zariah's life a misery. Why? Zariah still hadn't deciphered the reason. Perhaps it was her quiet nature, her refusal to engage in their petty power games. Perhaps it was simply the thrill of the hunt. The whistle blew again, signaling the start of the game. Dodgeballs flew through the air, a blur of red and blue. Zariah moved with a quiet grace, honed from years of practicing self-defense with her father. He'd taught her to anticipate, to react, to move like a shadow. She dodged a ball aimed at her chest, the wind of its passage a chilling reminder of its potential impact. Tinsley, her face contorted in a sneer, picked up another ball. Zariah saw the glint in her eye, the malicious intent that preceded the throw. This wasn't just a game. It was a targeted attack. The ball left Tinsley's hand, aimed directly at Zariah's face. Time seemed to slow. Zariah saw the trajectory, calculated the speed, and moved her head just inches, the ball whizzing past her ear, grazing her skin. A phantom sting, a whisper of what could have been. The gym fell silent. Even the rhythmic thumping of the basketballs seemed to hold its breath. Zariah straightened, her heart pounding against her ribs, a caged bird desperate for release. A slow, controlled breath. Survive, she repeated, the word a shield against the rising tide of anger. She walked towards Tinsley, each step deliberate, measured. The air crackled with anticipation. The other students, initially absorbed in the game, now watched, captivated by this silent confrontation. You got a problem? Zariah's voice was quiet, almost too low to be heard over the hum of the fluorescent lights. But the words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tinsley, momentarily taken aback by Zariah's unexpected response, stammered, It was an accident. The lie was flimsy, transparent. Zariah tilted her head, a single dark eyebrow arching. An accident aimed at my face? Tinsley flushed, a mottled red creeping up her neck. Bailey, standing beside her, shifted nervously, her eyes darting between Tinsley and Zariah. Before Tinsley could retort, the coach's whistle blew, cutting through the tense silence. Coleman, Richards, what's going on here? Coach Hernandez strode towards them, his face a mask of disapproval. She threw a ball in my face. Coach, Zariah said, her voice calm, devoid of any hint of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. It was an accident. Tinsley insisted, her voice shrill, laced with panic. She glanced at Addison, seeking support, but Addison remained silent, her eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. Enough! Coach Hernandez raised his hand, silencing them both. Richards apologized to Coleman. And both of you cool down. This is gym class, not a war zone. Tinsley muttered a half-hearted apology, her eyes still flashing with resentment. Zariah nodded, a curt acknowledgement. The storm had passed for now. The coach turned away, his attention drawn back to the game. The other students, however, continued to watch Zariah, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Amani, a quiet girl from Zariah's history class, offered a small, hesitant smile. It was a silent gesture of solidarity, a flicker of understanding in a sea of indifference. As the game resumed, Zariah retreated back to the edge of the court, the echoes of the confrontation still reverberating within her. She'd broken her silence, spoken her truth, and in doing so, had subtly shifted the balance of power. The fear, the constant apprehension that had clung to her like a second skin, seemed to loosen its grip. Later, in the locker room, as she changed back into her clothes, Zariah felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. She knew the battle wasn't over. Addison and her clique wouldn't forget this so easily. But something had changed. She'd shown them a glimpse of the steel beneath the surface, the quiet strength that her father had so carefully forged. And she realized, with a surprising sense of certainty, that she was ready for whatever came next. The fluorescent lights of the Franklin High cafeteria hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the chaotic symphony of teenage life. The air, thick with the aroma of reheated pizza and sugary drinks, buzzed with the energy of hundreds of chattering students. Zariah sat alone at a table near the window, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, a familiar solace in this unfamiliar landscape. She meticulously peeled the label from her water bottle, the repetitive motion a small anchor in the swirling currents of the room. Just another lunch break, she thought, another hour to navigate. It wasn't that she disliked people, not exactly. It was more that she hadn't found a reason yet to invest in the fleeting alliances of high school. Her energy was carefully rationed, a precious resource preserved for the things that truly mattered. Her Aunt Marcia, her studies, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed kata. A shadow fell across her table, the sudden shift in light pulling her from her thoughts. Addison stood there, flanked by Tinsley and Bailey, their faces a mixture of amusement and contempt. Zariah's hand stilled on the water bottle, her gaze lifting slowly to meet Addison's. The girl's blonde hair, perfectly styled, framed a face honed to an almost predatory sharpness. Zariah recognized the look, the glint of calculated cruelty in her eyes. It reminded her of the stray cats back in Indiana, the way they would circle a smaller animal, testing, probing for weakness. Don't react, Zariah told herself, her heart beating a steady rhythm against her ribs. They want a reaction. Don't give them one. You know, Addison began, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. I think it's cute how you keep sitting out here like you don't want to make friends. Tinsley and Bailey giggled, the sound sharp and brittle. Zariah watched them, a flicker of something akin to pity momentarily distracting her from the sharp awareness of Addison's presence. These girls, clinging to Addison like remoras to a shark, they were just as trapped as their prey. Their laughter felt hollow, their smiles brittle masks. They were performing, desperate for the validation of their alpha. I'm good, Zariah replied, her voice quiet but firm. She met Addison's gaze, refusing to flinch. Inside, a wave of weariness washed over her. This constant, low-level harassment was draining, a mosquito buzzing incessantly in her ear. She longed for the peace of her aunt's small apartment, the scent of jasmine tea and the comforting weight of her grandfather's worn leather-bound books. Addison's smile faltered, a crack appearing in her carefully constructed facade. Zariah could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface, the annoyance at being met with such unwavering indifference. It was a power play, and Zariah, by refusing to play, was disrupting the established order. This, Zariah realized, was what truly irritated Addison. Not the imagined slight, but the challenge to her authority. She's used to compliance, to fear, Zariah thought, a sliver of understanding cutting through her weariness. She doesn't know what to do with someone who isn't afraid. Seriously? Addison pressed, her voice hardening. You think you're too good for us? She leaned closer, invading Zariah's personal space. The scent of her perfume, something sharp and floral, filled Zariah's nostrils. The girls behind Addison shifted, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were waiting, anticipating the explosion. Zariah took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of the perfume momentarily choking her. Her hand tightened around her water bottle, the plastic crinkling softly. The mountain outside the window seemed miles away, a phantom limb of her former life. Stay calm, she repeated internally. Don't engage. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, the lessons learned in the dusty dojo back home resonating in the sterile environment of the school cafeteria. Control your breath. Control your emotions. Your strength comes from within. I don't think about you at all, Zariah said, her voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel that surprised even herself. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The cafeteria, momentarily silenced, seemed to hold its breath. Tinsley gasped a small surprised sound. Bailey's eyes widened, her gaze darting between Addison and Zariah. Even Addison seemed taken aback, her usual confidence momentarily shaken. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the tension, each flicker a countdown to the inevitable explosion. Zariah held her breath, waiting. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The first crack in the dam, the first tremor before the earthquake. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength, preparing for the aftershocks. The mountains in the distance, though obscured from view, remained a constant in her mind, a reminder of the quiet strength within her. The scent of jasmine tea, the feel of worn leather, the echo of her father's voice, these were her anchors, her shield against the storm that was gathering around her. The muted glow of the laptop screen painted Zariah's face in flickering hues of blue and gray. The apartment was quiet, Aunt Marcia already asleep, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of wind against the window pane. On the screen, a younger, leaner version of her father moved with a grace that belied the brutal efficiency of his actions. It was an old fight tape, one of many she'd unearthed from a box labeled Memories tucked away in the back of Marcia's closet. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, replaying a sequence where her father, barely out of his teens himself, sidestepped a jab, countered with a lightning-fast cross, and ended the fight before it truly began. Hands up, mind sharp, feet light. His voice echoed in her memory, a mantra etched into the very fabric of her being. You don't got to fight every time, but if they insist, you end it quick. He hadn't just taught her self-defense. He'd imprinted on her a philosophy of survival, a quiet strength forged in the crucible of a life she hadn't fully understood until much later. Zariah watched, her gaze fixed on the screen, yet seeing more than just the grainy footage. She saw the Indiana sun beating down on the dusty backyard where they trained, smelled the sweat and leather of his worn gloves, felt the sting of his corrective taps as he drilled her on footwork and form. He'd never wanted her to fight, not really. He'd hoped she'd never need to use the skills he'd so painstakingly instilled. But life, as he'd often said, had a way of throwing curveballs. Their life in Indiana hadn't been easy. The whispers, the sideways glances, the constant undercurrent of tension, she hadn't understood it then, not fully. Only later, after his passing, piecing together fragments of conversations overheard, did she begin to grasp the weight he'd carried, the battles he'd fought outside the ring, battles that had ultimately broken him, leaving her with nothing but these tapes and the echo of his voice, his lessons a shield against a world that seemed determined to knock her down. Colorado was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to escape the shadows of the past. But the whispers, the glances, they'd followed her, morphing into the sneers and taunts of Addison and her posse. Zariah closed her eyes, the image of Addison's triumphant smirk burning behind her lids. The hallway incident, the spilled coffee, the escalating acts of petty cruelty, they were all calculated, designed to provoke a reaction. And for weeks, Zariah had refused to rise to the bait. Her father's words resonated in her mind. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest move. But there was a limit, a point where silence became complicity, where turning the other cheek felt like surrendering a piece of herself. The locker room, the memory played out in slow motion. Addison's taunts echoing off the tiled walls, the hands reaching for her bag, the deliberate shove. In that instant, something snapped. The years of suppressed frustration, the weight of her father's legacy, the instinct for survival, all coalesced into a single, focused action. She hadn't wanted to fight, but she hadn't hesitated either. Zariah opened her eyes, the laptop screen, now, displaying the frozen image of her father mid-punch. His eyes, even in the grainy video, seemed to hold a knowing look, a silent understanding of the choices she'd made, the path she was forced to walk. She rubbed her knuckles, the phantom ache a reminder of the impact, the swiftness and precision with which she'd ended the confrontation. There was no satisfaction in the victory, only a dull weariness. She knew the consequences would be swift and harsh. Suspension, maybe even expulsion. Aunt Marcia would be disappointed, worried. The thought of her aunt's concerned face tightened a knot in Zariah's chest. But beneath the weariness, another feeling began to stir, a quiet sense of resolve. She'd broken the cycle, shattered the illusion of Addison's invincibility. The whispers in the hallways had changed their tone. She'd seen it in the eyes of the other girls, the flicker of fear, of respect, perhaps even of admiration. Amani's hesitant smile, the unspoken solidarity in her gaze, it was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Zariah closed the laptop, the silence of the apartment now heavier, thicker. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, feeling the lingering adrenaline slowly ebb away. The fight, the suspension, it was all part of a larger, more complex game. She understood that now. High school was a battlefield of its own kind, a place where reputations were forged and broken, where alliances shifted like desert sands. She'd never wanted to be a fighter, but she wouldn't be a victim either. Her father's lessons hadn't just prepared her for physical confrontations. They'd equipped her with the tools to navigate the treacherous currents of human interaction, to discern friend from foe, to stand her ground even when the odds were stacked against her. She was her father's daughter, and she would survive. Not just survive, but thrive. She would carve her own path, write her own story on her own terms. The fight in the locker room hadn't been an end, but a beginning. A new chapter, filled with uncertainty, but also with a newfound sense of purpose. The quiet girl from Indiana was finding her voice, her strength echoing in the silence of the Colorado night. The fluorescent lights of the locker room hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of chattering girls and the slamming of locker doors. The air, thick with the scent of sweat and cheap deodorant, clung to Zariah like a second skin. She moved with an almost practiced detachment, her gaze fixed on the dull gray of her locker. Each click of the combination locked a small, precise victory against the rising tide of anxiety in her chest. Just get through this, Zariah. Just get through. She'd repeated the mantra countless times since arriving at Franklin High, a shield against the constant, insidious whispers and stares that followed her like shadows. Today, the shadows had teeth. Zariah opened her locker, the metallic screech grating on her already frayed nerves. Inside, her gym bag lay slumped against the side, a splash of cherry red against the bleak metal. Something felt wrong. The air shifted, the scent of chlorine and sweat replaced by something sickly sweet. A premonition, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed calm. Oops! Addison's voice, dripping with saccharine malice, echoed from behind. Zariah turned slowly, her eyes tracing the arc of shimmering, pearlescent lotion cascading from Addison's upturned hand, a slow, deliberate waterfall of viscous pink that pooled in the bottom of Zariah's gym bag, soaking into the fabric. Tinsley and Bailey flanked Addison, their faces a mixture of nervous excitement and suppressed laughter, like hyenas circling a wounded gazelle. "Don't react," Zariah told herself, the words a tight knot in her throat. "Don't give them what they want." Ignoring them had been her strategy, her only defense against their relentless campaign of petty cruelties. But something in the deliberate, almost ritualistic way Addison poured the lotion, the smug curl of her lip, chipped away at Zariah's carefully constructed wall of indifference. "Oh, I am so sorry," Addison drawled, her voice echoing in the near-empty locker room. "Didn't see your ethnic gym bag there." The word ethnic hung in the air, thick with unspoken prejudice, a pointed jab at Zariah's darker skin. Zariah felt a flicker of anger, a hot coal igniting in the pit of her stomach. It was different this time. This wasn't just about tripped hallways and whispered insults. This was a deliberate act of violation, a public display of dominance. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, the quiet, steady cadence of his lessons. "Control your emotions, Zariah. They're your strength, not your weakness. But never let anyone mistake your quiet for fear." "You sure?" Zariah's voice was surprisingly steady, a low rumble that cut through the nervous giggles of Addison's entourage. The question hung in the air, a challenge disguised as a simple query. Addison's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She hadn't expected a response, let alone this calmness. It unnerved her, this quiet strength emanating from the girl she'd dismissed as an easy target. "What did you just say to me?" Addison stepped closer, her voice laced with a dangerous edge. "She's used to fear," Zariah realized, a strange sense of clarity washing over her. "She feeds on it." But Zariah wouldn't give her that satisfaction. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't flinch. "Are you sure you didn't see my bag?" Zariah repeated, her gaze unwavering. Addison lunged, her hand raised to strike. The movement was predictable, telegraphed. Years of training with her father, the sharp, precise movements of self-defense drilled into her muscle memory, took over. Zariah sidestepped, her arm shooting out to deflect the blow. A gasp rippled through the room. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, broken only by the frantic thumping of Zariah's heart. Addison stumbled, her face contorted in a mixture of shock and rage. She hadn't expected resistance. No one ever resisted. The sudden shift in power, the realization that she was no longer in control, sent a wave of panic through her. What happened next was a blur of movement. Zariah moved with a precision that belied her quiet demeanor. A swift control block, a perfectly timed counter. Addison's cry of surprise turned into a yelp of pain as she crumpled to the floor. A phone clicked, capturing the scene. The buzzing of the camera was a stark reminder that this wasn't just a private confrontation. This was public, recorded, a spectacle for the entire school to dissect and analyze. The sudden intrusion of Coach Hernandez, her whistle shrilling like a banshee's wail, shattered the tense tableau. Followed closely by Principal Myers, their faces etched with varying degrees of shock and disapproval. They surveyed the scene. Addison sprawled on the floor, Tinsley and Bailey hovering over her, their faces pale with fear, and Zariah standing motionless, her chest heaving, her fists clenched at her sides. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, the sterile light casting long, distorted shadows on the locker room walls. The air, thick with the smell of sweat and something else, something acrid and metallic, clung to Zariah, a tangible reminder of a line she'd just crossed. The quiet, detached observer was gone, replaced by a quiet warrior, the echoes of her father's lessons resonating in her ears. Control your emotions. They're your strength. She hadn't started this, but she had finished it. And in the unsettling silence of the locker room, Zariah knew that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully constructed hierarchy of Franklin High, the delicate balance of power that Addison had so meticulously crafted, had cracked. And in that crack, a seed of change had been sown, a seed of defiance, a seed of hope. The fluorescent lights of Principal Meyer's office hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony that had played out in the locker room earlier. Zariah sat stiffly in the hard plastic chair, the chill of the metal seeping through her jeans. Her knuckles, still faintly bruised, rested loosely in her lap. She could still feel the phantom sting, a dull ache that mirrored the hollowness in her stomach. 3 days. 3 days suspended. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a weight pressing down on her chest. She'd known there would be consequences. Her father had drilled it into her alongside every self-defense move. Every block, every counter, every strike came with the silent caveat. Power is a responsibility, and sometimes responsibility meant accepting the fallout. Principal Myers, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with a weary concern, shuffled the papers on his desk. The rhythmic rustle was the only sound for a long, stretched moment. Zariah watched him, her gaze steady, unblinking. She recognized the tired disappointment in his eyes, the subtle slump of his shoulders. He looked at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, a disruption in the carefully ordered world of Redwood High. He probably saw her as another statistic, another troubled teen. The thought pricked at her, a flicker of anger in the otherwise calm surface of her emotions. She wasn't troubled. She was just surviving. Zariah, Principal Myers began, his voice low and measured. I've reviewed the statements, spoken to the witnesses, and well, there's no other way to put this. The school has a zero-tolerance policy on violence. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. You understand this, right? I didn't hit first, Zariah replied, her voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air, stark and unadorned. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer excuses or justifications. The facts were the facts. The weeks of taunts, the tripped trays, the whispered insults, the escalating acts of aggression culminating in the shove in the locker room, none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the final act, the moment her fist connected with Addison's jaw. That was the moment that had brought her here, to this sterile office, under the unforgiving glare of the fluorescent lights. Inside, a different kind of tension coiled tight. She hadn't expected understanding, not really, but a small, stubborn part of her had hoped for acknowledgement. A flicker of recognition that she hadn't started this, that she'd been pushed, cornered, forced to react. But Principal Meyer's face remained impassive, a mask of professional neutrality. He was bound by rules, by procedures, by the unwavering dictates of zero tolerance. And she, it seemed, was bound by the consequences. I understand the policy, sir, Zariah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. 3 days. 3 days away from the whispers, the stares, the constant, low-humming tension of Addison's presence. Part of her welcomed the reprieve, the silence. But another part, a deeper, more unsettling part, felt a strange pang of disappointment. This wasn't victory. This was just a pause, a temporary ceasefire in a war that was far from over. Principal Myers sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. 3 days, Zariah. Starting tomorrow. I expect you to use this time to reflect on your actions. He paused, his gaze softening just a fraction. And perhaps consider a more constructive way of handling these situations in the future. Zariah didn't reply. What was there to say? She'd already tried ignoring it, tried walking away, tried to disappear into the background noise of Redwood High. But the whispers had followed her, clinging to her like shadows. And the shadows had teeth. The silence in the office stretched, thick and suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, drilling into her skull. She wanted to leave, to escape the weight of the principal's gaze, the sterile confines of the room. She wanted to go home, to the quiet sanctuary of her aunt's house, to the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books. She wanted to curl up on the couch with a worn copy of Wuthering Heights and lose herself in the bleak, windswept moors of Yorkshire, a world far removed from the petty cruelties of high school. As she stood to leave, A fleeting thought crossed her mind. She wondered what Addison was doing right now. Was she celebrating her victory, basking in the glow of Zariah's suspension? Or was she, perhaps, feeling a flicker of unease, a prickle of awareness that something had shifted, that the balance of power had subtly, irrevocably changed? Zariah didn't know the answer. But as she walked out of the principal's office, her chin held high, her gaze steady, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was something else entirely. It was the quiet strength that comes from knowing you've stood your ground, from knowing you've faced the storm and emerged, bruised but unbroken. 3 days. It was a small price to pay. And in the echoing silence of the hallway, Zariah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The fluorescent lights of Franklin High buzzed, a dull, insistent hum that mirrored the tension crackling through the hallways. The whispers followed Zariah like a second skin, clinging to her even as she tried to disappear into the anonymity of the crowded corridors. Each glance, curious or cautious, felt like a pinprick, a constant reminder of the raw exposure of the locker room. She had anticipated the fallout, the hushed discussions, the sideways stares, but the reality of it, the sheer weight of collective attention, was a suffocating blanket. Her stomach churned, a tight knot of unease that tightened with each passing face. She just wanted to be invisible, to melt into the faded linoleum and escape the scrutiny. The whispers mutated as she walked, taking on new forms, laced with fear, awe, and even admiration. The thought felt foreign, uncomfortable. She hadn't sought this kind of recognition, this strange blend of notoriety and respect. All she had wanted was silence, an end to the incessant torment. She'd thought about her father's words, his lessons echoing in the hollow spaces of her mind. Control the chaos, Zariah. Don't let it control you. But control felt like a fragile illusion in this swirling vortex of adolescent judgment. In the cafeteria, the usual cacophony of lunchtime chatter seemed subdued, replaced by an undercurrent of hushed speculation. She saw Addison's group huddled at their usual table, their faces tight, their whispers sharp and venomous. Tinsley's gaze, usually so brazen, flickered away as Zariah met her eyes. Bailey, ever the satellite, mirrored Addison's rigid posture, her face a mask of strained indifference. Zariah felt a flicker of something cold and sharp within her satisfaction. No, not quite. It was more like a grim acknowledgement, a recognition that the balance of power had shifted, however subtly. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to look away, to focus on the mundane task of navigating the lunch line. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of the library, a voice broke through the fragile peace Zariah had managed to construct around herself. I think she's waiting. It was Amani, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Zariah looked up, surprised. Amani usually kept to herself, a quiet observer in the swirling drama of high school life. Who? Zariah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Amani's gaze flickered towards Addison's table, now visible through the library's large windows. Addison, she replied, her voice low. She's waiting for you to break. She wants to see you scared. Zariah considered this, the words resonating with an uncomfortable truth. Fear was there, a persistent hum beneath the surface, but it was intertwined with something else, a quiet resolve, a hardening of her inner core. She met Amani's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The walk home was a blur of muted colors and swirling thoughts. The confrontation in the locker room replayed in her mind, a visceral loop of adrenaline and fear and a strange, unsettling sense of liberation. She hadn't planned it, hadn't anticipated the eruption of anger that had driven her to finally push back. But in the aftermath, a strange sense of calm had settled over her, a quiet understanding that silence wasn't always strength. Sometimes, the loudest roar came from within. The warmth of her Aunt Marcia's home was a welcome refuge. The smell of baking bread, a familiar comfort, permeated the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, antiseptic scent of the school. Marcia's gaze was perceptive, her silence more comforting than any words could have been. "You okay, Z?" she finally asked, her voice gentle. Zariah hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know," she finally admitted, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Marcia nodded, her understanding unwavering. "Tell me what happened," she said, her voice laced with a quiet strength that Zariah had always admired. As Zariah recounted the events of the day, the fear and uncertainty that had clung to her began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of clarity. Marcia listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Zariah finished, a long silence hung between them. Finally, Marcia spoke, her voice low and thoughtful. "You gotta learn when to strategize, not just react, Zariah." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Fighting back felt good in the moment, didn't it? Like finally breaking free. Zariah nodded, the truth of her words resonating deep within her. Marcia continued, her gaze steady. "But Addison, she thrives on this kind of drama. She feeds off it. You gave her exactly what she wanted, a spectacle." Zariah felt a pang of unease. Marcia's words were a cold splash of reality against the fleeting satisfaction she'd felt. She'd acted impulsively, driven by a raw need to defend herself, but in doing so, she'd played into Addison's hands. "So what do I do now?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Think, Zariah," Marcia replied, her voice firm but gentle. "This isn't just about winning a fight. It's about changing the game. You need to make her understand that you're not afraid, but you're also not going to be her puppet. You choose your battles." The word echoed in Zariah's mind. Choose. It was a simple word, yet it held immense power. She had always felt like a pawn in Addison's games, forced to react to her whims, to endure her constant barrage of insults and petty cruelties. But now something had shifted. She had made a choice, a conscious decision to break free from the cycle of intimidation. The suspension, the whispers, the scrutiny, it was all a price she was willing to pay. The fear was still there, a persistent hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer the driving force. It was overshadowed by something stronger, something more enduring. She had tasted a different kind of power, the power of choice, the power of self-possession. "I chose," she whispered, the words barely audible, yet imbued with a quiet conviction that resonated through the room. The faintest hint of a smile touched Marcia's lips. The game had changed, and Zariah, for the first time, felt like she was finally playing her own hand. The fluorescent lights of Franklin High's hallway buzzed, a monotonous drone that mirrored the low hum of anxiety in Zariah's chest. 10 days. 10 days since the locker room incident, 10 days suspended, 10 days spent dissecting every second of the confrontation, every word, every reaction. Returning felt like stepping onto a stage, the spotlight of unseen eyes burning into her. She'd expected whispers, stares, maybe even outright hostility. Instead, there was a strange, unsettling quiet, a vacuum of sound that amplified the click of her boots against the linoleum floor, each step echoing the beat of her uncertain heart. She reached her locker, the cool metal a familiar anchor in this sea of unease. As she spun the combination, a small, folded piece of paper slipped out, landing face down on the floor. Hesitantly, she picked it up. A single line, written in bold, block letters. Sometimes you gotta break silence to be heard. Respect. No signature. Zariah stared at the note, the words a stark contrast to the sterile, impersonal metal of the locker. Respect. A word that had felt so distant, so unattainable just a few weeks ago. Now it hung in the air, tangible, almost palpable. A flicker of something warm, something akin to hope, ignited in her chest. But even as she tucked the note into her pocket, a layer of skepticism remained. Was this a genuine sentiment, or another layer of the twisted game Addison and her clique played? She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the phantom weight of unseen eyes assessing her every move. The first few classes passed in a blur. the usual drone of lectures fading into the background noise of her thoughts. The silence of her classmates was more unnerving than any open hostility would have been. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken things, with shifted perceptions, with a recalibration of the social landscape. Zariah could feel the undercurrent, the subtle change in the air, but she couldn't decipher its meaning. Lunch was a solitary affair. She chose a table in the far corner of the cafeteria, the noise and chatter washing over her without truly penetrating her thoughts. Each bite of her sandwich felt mechanical, the taste bland, the texture uninteresting. She found herself tracing the outline of the folded note in her pocket, the rough edges of the paper a grounding sensation against her fingertips. The words, "Sometimes you got to break silence to be heard," echoed in her mind. It was her father's philosophy distilled into a single sentence. He had always taught her that silence could be a weapon, but it could also be a cage. And sometimes, breaking free from that cage was the only way to truly be free. As she was leaving the cafeteria, a voice called out her name. "Zariah." It was Coach Hernandez, the wrestling coach. His broad frame filled the doorway, his expression unreadable. Zariah's pulse quickened. She'd seen the wrestling team practicing, the controlled aggression, the disciplined movements. It was a world she'd always observed from a distance, a world that felt both familiar and foreign. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Zariah nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She followed him into the empty gym, the smell of sweat and rubber mats filling the air. The vastness of the space, usually alive with the sounds of exertion and grunts of effort, felt strangely intimate in its silence. "I saw what happened," Coach Hernandez said, his gaze steady, in the locker room. Zariah's stomach clenched. She braced herself for a reprimand, for another lecture on appropriate behavior, on the importance of following school rules. But the words didn't come. Instead, Coach Hernandez continued, "I also saw how you handled yourself. You showed restraint, control, discipline." He paused, his eyes scanning her face, as if searching for something. "You have the makings of a good wrestler, Zariah. Raw talent, natural instinct." He gestured towards the mats. "We have tryouts next week. Think about it." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Zariah stared at the wrestling mats, the worn canvas a tapestry of sweat and effort, of victories and defeats. It was a world she had always admired from afar, a world that resonated with the quiet strength she had cultivated within herself. A world where silence wasn't a sign of weakness, but a strategy. A world where breaking the silence could be an act of power. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "I'll think about it," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. As she walked out of the gym, the fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed less harsh, the monotonous drone less oppressive. The weight of unseen eyes no longer felt like a burden, but a challenge. The note in her pocket crinkled softly, a reminder that sometimes breaking the silence was the only way to find her voice. Amani appeared beside her as she walked down the hall, a shy smile on her face. "Hey, Zariah," she murmured. "I just wanted to say I saw what happened. In the locker room, I mean, and I'm glad you did what you did." Amani's words, though quiet, were a balm to Zariah's still raw nerves. The silent acknowledgement, the unspoken solidarity, it meant more than any grand gesture of support. It was a crack in the wall of isolation she had built around herself, a glimpse of connection in a place that had felt so alien. Later that day, Zariah found herself standing before the mirror in her aunt's bathroom, the note from her locker spread out on the counter. Marcia's voice drifted in from the kitchen, the familiar sounds of dinner preparation a comforting backdrop to her thoughts. She looked at her reflection, really looked for the first time in days. The bruises were fading, the cuts healing. But the change went deeper than skin deep. There was a new set to her jaw, a new fire in her eyes. The silence she had worn as a shield had become a source of strength. She folded the note carefully, tucking it back into her pocket. She knew the whispers wouldn't stop completely, The stairs wouldn't disappear overnight. But something had shifted. The power dynamics had changed. And for the first time since arriving in Colorado, Zariah felt a flicker of hope, a sense of belonging, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, she could find her place in this new world on her own terms. The silence wouldn't hold her captive. She would break it when she chose, and her voice would be heard. The fluorescent lights of Franklin High hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the final scenes of Zariah's first semester. The air, thick with the scent of stale cafeteria food and lingering disinfectant, held a different charge now. The whispers that followed her down the hallways were no longer laced with derision, but a hesitant curiosity, a recognition. The once impenetrable fortress of Addison's reign had crumbled, brick by painstaking brick. Zariah could feel it in the way Addison's gaze, once sharp and predatory, now slid away, a flicker of unease in its depths. The shift in the social landscape was subtle, like the changing of seasons. Where once Tinsley and Bailey trailed Addison like shadows, their faces reflecting her every whim, they now lagged a step behind, their eyes darting nervously towards Zariah. The fear they'd once projected onto others had turned inwards, a constant tremor beneath their carefully constructed facades. Zariah, however, felt none of the triumphant rush she'd imagined. The silence in her own world, the one she'd carefully constructed around herself, was more comforting than the cacophony of their defeat. It was a quiet victory, one she carried within like a smooth, cool stone. She'd spent the past few weeks navigating the aftermath of the locker room incident, the suspensions, the meetings with Coach Hernandez and Principal Myers. Their words, initially laced with disbelief, gradually shifted towards understanding as the full extent of Addison's bullying tactics came to light. Amani's quiet testimony, her voice barely above a whisper yet firm in its conviction, had been the final piece of the puzzle. Zariah watched her across the cafeteria now, their eyes meeting briefly in a silent acknowledgement. Amani offered a small, hesitant smile, a fragile blossom of solidarity in the sterile environment. Zariah allowed a hint of a smile to touch her own lips, a rare and precious expression. Aunt Marcia's voice echoed in her mind, calm and reassuring. You did what you had to, Zariah. Strength isn't always about being loud. Sometimes, the quietest storms leave the deepest marks. Her aunt's words were a balm to the raw edges of the experience. They spoke to the core of Zariah's being, validating the instinct that had guided her, the quiet strength that had always been her shield. The idea had been simmering at the back of Zariah's mind for a while now, a flicker of interest ignited by the wrestling posters plastered on the gymnasium walls. The controlled aggression, the disciplined movements, the quiet intensity, it resonated with something deep within her. Her father's lessons, once a painful reminder of his absence, now felt like a legacy, a part of her she was finally ready to embrace. He had taught her more than just self-defense. He had taught her the art of quiet power, the ability to harness her inner strength and channel it into focused action. Zariah, hey. Coach Hernandez's voice boomed across the hallway, startling her from her thoughts. He strode towards her, a surprisingly gentle smile on his usually stern face. I was hoping to catch you. I wanted to talk to you about the wrestling team. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a sudden drumbeat of anticipation. I was thinking about trying out, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Coach Hernandez beamed. That's great news. We could definitely use someone with your spirit. He paused, searching for the right word. Resilience. He finally settled on, his eyes twinkling. You have a quiet resilience, Zariah. It's a valuable asset on the mat and in life. His words resonated with her, echoing the sentiments of her aunt, affirming the path she was tentatively carving for herself. The wrestling team, once an improbable notion, now felt like a possibility, a place where her quiet strength could find a voice. The final bell rang, its shrill tone slicing through the air, signaling the end of the semester. As students streamed out of the building, Their voices a rising crescendo of anticipation for the break. Zariah lingered, her gaze fixed on the wrestling posters. The images of grappling figures, locked in a silent battle of strength and skill, held a new meaning for her. It wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about discipline, control, and the quiet power that resided within. She took a deep breath, the crisp Colorado air filling her lungs. The fear and uncertainty that had shadowed her for so long were beginning to recede, replaced by a burgeoning sense of self-assurance. The hallways of Franklin High, once a battleground, now felt like a space of possibility. She had weathered the storm, and in its wake, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. As she stepped out into the winter afternoon, the setting sun painting the snow-capped mountains in hues of pink and gold, a sense of quiet peace settled over her. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught her a valuable lesson. Strength wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, the quietest whispers could ignite the most profound change. The world often mistook silence for weakness, but Zariah knew better. Silence could be a strategy, a shield, and ultimately, a source of immense power. It was in the quiet spaces, in the moments of introspection, that true strength was forged. And Zariah, armed with the quiet power within her, was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.